We're going to start with C and LM.jpg. Call that puppy up. If you're wondering about the name, it stands for crop and layer mask. So we're going to crop this image down and we're going to use a layer mask to put it onto a new white background. Call up your crop tool. Just hit C on the keyboard, that'll grab the crop tool. And in this case, we have no specific sizing. They haven't said it has to be so many inches. They haven't said it has to be whatever resolution. So when you click on the little pop-up up here, set it to width by height by resolution. And if you don't want it to resize at all, you don't want it to try to scale up or scale down, just hit the clear button. And that'll get rid of all the dimensions that are in there. So you can just kind of freely crop it to whatever you want it to look like. It's not going to try to make new pixels or, squish it down. And I'm just going to put a pleasing crop around the glass there, leaving a little bit of space around. That'll be the white background. Don't worry about the bottle or the cork or anything like that. Now I've got an overlay set on mine. There's the rule of thirds. Yours is probably set to auto, so when you start cropping, it'll turn on the little auto overlay there. And you might notice that it kind of looks like the glass isn't exactly straight. Like if I pull this little middle line here over top of the stem of the glass, of course, you only see it when it's on. If you want it to be on all the time, you can always click on this little mesh icon and pop it to always show overlay. And if you want one right down the center, like say I'm trying to put this glass in the center there, if we go to grid, that'll put one right in the center there. And I can tell already that this glass isn't straight. Look at that. The center line goes right down the middle of the stem there, but then it kind of ends up to the right at the bottom of the glass on the foot there, but then it's a little bit to the left inside the oval of it, which makes me think that this isn't quite vertical. How could we deal with something like that? We can do it right from the crop tool. If you hover outside the little grid there, that little mesh shape, if we hover outside and we do a click and a drag around, we can rotate it this way. We can swing this around until it looked nice and vertical compared to the center. But there's another tool that can actually do it as well. At the top here, there's this little icon that looks like, like a little Louis Vuitton handbag or something. It actually is like a carpenter's level. You put it down and there's a little bubble at the top and you kind of move it, and when the bubble's in the center, you know that it's level. So let's say you've photographed a landscape and there's a lake, and maybe you weren't using a tripod, maybe you'd been drinking a bit or whatever, and your camera was a little bit tilted, and suddenly you've got a lake where the horizon is crooked. So like one side of the lake is higher than the other, which makes the people on the low side really nervous. With this tool, you could click on one end of the lake, right on the surface, drag across to the other side, and that would tell it, make that line horizontal, and it'll automatically straighten it out. And you can actually use the same tool on this little glass here. Like if I turn off my overlay, and I grab my little straighten tool, and I kind of go from the middle of the top of the glass, and I click and I drag right down through to the middle of the bottom of the glass. As long as this line is parallel with the glass, when I let go, it automatically adjusts the crop to match. Now, depending on how you've got your Photoshop set, yours might look different than mine. Like I've got mine set to classic mode. See this little gear icon here between the mesh and the delete cropped pixels? If you click on that, yours is probably in the non-classic mode. This is a version that they introduced a few versions of Photoshop ago, and it throws off people that are used to the classic mode. This is when it became officially known as the crap tool. But if you want that where this moves around and the image doesn't make you want to vomit, you can use the classic mode. Just click on the pop-up, go to classic, and then the image stays still. It's the overlay, okay? Use that little straighten tool, give it a, there we go. And then you can nudge the sides around until you get a pleasing amount of breathing space around the outside of the glass there. And because we have turned off any values in here, it's not going to try to scale it down or make it larger. It's just saying, get rid of this stuff around here and rotate this to vertical. So when it looks good, hit the check mark, and that'll crop it and straighten it. Or you can hit return on the keyboard, up to you. Are we ready to play with the pen tool? All right. So P on the keyboard, that'll call up your pen tool. And remember the steps. It's click to start somewhere. If you need to make a curve, click and drag. Keep going around until you come back to where you started. When you get to that first point that you made, when you hover over it, you'll see that little circle icon. When you click, that'll close it off. You'll notice there's some little hard corners on the inside there. You're going to have to break some arms. I'll go over that when we get there. And don't be afraid to zoom in a bit as well. Don't try to cut it out when you're like this far out. Get in close, take a good look. Oh, and make sure, guys, remember last week we were playing around with the pen tool in shape mode? If you're in shape mode, it's going to make a shape. So make sure that it is set to path mode, and then it will make a path. Click, and then click and drag to get your curves.
Why is it filling?
Guys, kind of a neat way to think about these points. Like, take a look on the screen for a second. Let's say I got to here, I did the bottom one, then I come to here, I do a click, and it just kind of uses that curve at the bottom to go straight across this dot here. But as I pull upwards, remember these little handles appear, and the top handle is connected to the bottom handle. If I move the top handle to the left, the bottom handle goes right. If I make the top handle shorter, the bottom handle also becomes shorter. And remember I said, think of the point, that little square in the center, as a cannon, and it's firing a cannonball towards that little point up there. The longer the handle gets, the longer that arm gets, the more gunpowder you're putting into there. So let's say I came down to here, and I did a click and a pull. If I lengthen this arm, look at how much that starts to swoop around. This will become more important in the next one that we cut out, the rings. But for now, just remember, the longer you pull that arm, the farther it's going to fire that cannonball, the more gunpowder you got in there. If you need to break an arm, and actually take a look on the screen again for a second, look down here. Remember I said there's some little kind of V-notches in there, and let's say I select this and I'm like, oh, look, this handle works out good here, but this one, remember I said think of it as a cannon that's firing a cannonball towards this point. This handle is firing it straight down into the glass, and then this gravity pulls it over. I need to fire the cannonball this direction, so it kind of curves around the surface of the planet, curves around the surface of the foot here. But if I pull this one up so it fires that direction, again, it's attached to the handle on the other side, so this fixes it beautifully. Now it's firing its cannonball right to here, boom, and then thump, pulled down by gravity. But the one on the other side isn't working, so I grab this and I straighten it out, and then this one messes up. We're going to have to break an arm. If you hold down the Option key, at first you see nothing, but when you hover over that point, you see that little V-notch, that little bird beak icon. That's the Convert Point tool. And if I use that to grab this handle, snap, it's no longer associated with this handle up here. I can move it wherever I want. So you can use that when you get into those little tight areas. Now, depending on how your pen tool was set, you may find, as I have, that your path is actually inside out. If something like this happens, take a look on the screen for a second. You can see my path is white around the outside and then gray in the center. Gray is the part that's not selected. White is what is selected. So if I were to load this as a selection or send it to the client and say, there's your image with the clipping path, they would end up with a hole in the image with a bottle and a cork and a transparent hole in the center. If something like that happens, make sure you have the path selected, and to get her selected, hold down the Command key, click somewhere on that path, you'll see the little handles and points become visible. And from this little pop-up, these two little overlapping rectangles, aha! Mine is set to Subtract Front Shape, so it's actually not selecting the inner part. If I go to Combine Shapes, there we go, that's what we're looking for. Gray on the outside, not selected, white on the inside. All right, now, layer masks. What are layer masks all about? They could hide or reveal the layer that it's attached to, right? How could I use this path to create a layer mask? At the bottom of the Paths panel, oh look, this little dotted circle down here. Whatever you see in here, not selected on the gray, selected in the white, is what will get loaded up as a selection. Oh, actually, I shouldn't do mine yet, and actually this explains why I was seeing this little gap up here. I haven't finished my path. Look at this. Blue line all the way up to this point. No blue line connecting these. I hadn't closed that off. And now I've got that little snowflake icon. If you ever see that snowflake icon, that little asterisk there, it means that it's going to start making a new subpath. I've lost my association with that last point that I created. If you ever see this while you're making a path and you want to continue working on that path, hover over the last point, and when you see that little chain link icon, click. That reassociates you with that path that you were working on. Then I can move up to the first point that I made, and you'll see that little circle appears, meaning that it will close off that path. There we go. And if I look at this thing now, you can see that it's closed up. It's gone all the way around the outside there. All right. So let's load that up as a selection. Just click that little dotted circle, and you should have a marquee around your wine glass based on that path that you created. Now, if we wanted this to be a glass on a white background, first we'd have to get rid of the old background. And when you have an active selection, here's the cool thing about layer masks. When you have an active selection and you create a new layer mask, the layer mask will be based on the selection. So pop back into your layers panel there. And at the bottom of the layers panel, there's that white rectangle with the gray circle in it. If you click on that, boink, it adds a layer mask. And whatever was selected will be visible. Whatever wasn't selected will be hidden. Can we throw this onto a white background? I think we can. I'm just going to make a new transparent layer here. Click that. That'll make a new transparent layer, which we can then, from the Edit menu, fill with white. And then drag it to the bottom of the stack. Okay, now let's talk about this layer mask that we've created. If they were just going to run this as is, we'd have a glass of wine on a white background, awesome. But if this was an actual photograph of a glass of wine, you would expect that probably it'd be the light shining on it, maybe a little bit of fall off, some darkness around the edge there. Also, if this was on a reflective surface like, plexiglass or something, you'd probably see a bit of a reflection, wouldn't you? In fact, if I were to take a look at the original image, and you're like, well, how can you take a look at the original image? There's a layer mask hiding it. Yes, but you can temporarily disable a layer mask by holding the Shift key and clicking on it. And if I zoom in on the foot there, oh look, yeah, there is a reflection. It's on some kind of like plexiglass. You're getting a bit of a reflection. Shift click again to bring it back. How can I get that reflection back? Well, it's a layer mask. So on a layer mask, black hides, white reveals. I could play around with the path. The thing about using a path is it would have to have a very hard edge. This has a bit of a soft edge. If I took a paintbrush and let's say, look at the edge there, it's kind of a bit of a softer sort of edge. So what if I took a paintbrush, make sure it has a nice soft edge there, and with some white paint, okay, maybe a higher opacity, 100%, just hit 0 there. Oh, if you hit the / key, it makes your layer mask show up red as a ruby lith. I must have accidentally bumped the / key. I was hoping nobody would notice. I was frankly trying to get rid of it. But if I were to paint white there, or if I do it while it's visible, I can bring that reflection back. So I could paint and bring back that slight reflection, and across the bottom of the glass there too. And that's kind of the great thing about these layer masks. Because it's pixel-based, because it is a raster image, just a bunch of colored squares, well in this case just a bunch of black and white squares, we can play around with the softness of edges. Like the pen tool, you can see, created a really hard edge. With this brush, I can make a softer edge and just kind of gently bring back something that's slightly out of focus. When you're working on a layer mask, this is something I probably should have mentioned earlier, you do want to make sure that you have pure black and pure white as your foreground and background colors. If you're working and you've got, say, really light gray as your foreground and really dark gray as your background color, and you're painting away on a layer mask, you think, there we go, I'm hiding and revealing. Except the dark gray won't quite hide. It'll always be slightly visible, and the light gray won't quite bring it back. How do we make sure that we have pure black and pure white, or our default colors? D on the keyboard, make sure you got pure black and pure white. And if you need 100% opacity, how do you get that on the keyboard? 0, there's your 100% opacity. And then by painting white on the layer mask, and here's another important point, do make sure that you have the layer mask selected. See these little 4 corner frame things around it? If they're around the layer itself, I'm not painting on the layer mask, I'm painting on the layer. It looks like I've been cutting away at it, but I've actually just been painting white right over top of the image. So do make sure you have the layer mask selected. And then when you paint with white, it'll bring back that reflection down below. Guys, one thing I forgot to do when I was in my paths was what?
Rename the path.
Rename my path. It's called work path, which means it's in danger of being destroyed. Let's say the client was like, hey, there's an olive in there. Can you get the olive? And I'm like, no problem. Let me grab my pen tool. Watch the work path if I click to outline the olive. Boing! Oh! The outline of the glass disappeared. A work path is temporary, always in danger of being destroyed if you try to make another work path. How do I make this permanent? Rename it. I can just double click, and I'll call this my wine glass. And now if I try to make another path to do the olive, it makes a new work path, but the wine glass remains. So don't forget to name your path. I should have mentioned that earlier. Remember I said, imagine the light is shining into the center here. You get a little bit of fall off towards the edges. How could we add some fall off onto that? How could we make it look like it's a little bit darker towards the edges? There's a few ways. What if I just painted some black on? I mean, it sounds a little simplistic, but first off, should I go above or below the glass, do you think? I'd probably go below it just so it appears on the background layer there. And I don't want to do it directly on the background layer. Like I don't want to take my black paint and just, paint some fall off onto the edge like that. It's a little bit, hard to fix if it's on the background layer like that. But what if I did it on a new transparent layer? Then I could do a little bit of gentle fall off around the edges. And if I don't like it, I can just throw the layer in the trash. Or I could just grab my eraser and I could erase the parts that I don't like. So that might have been a little bit intense. Let me go through that again. I'm just going to go to the bottom here, make a new transparent layer. And if I want a little bit of gentle fall off, well, the last brush I used was probably too hard edged. So I'm just going to right click and take this hardness all the way down to 0. I want to make sure I have black paint on there so I can hit D on the keyboard, X if I need to switch it around. And I'm going to bring that opacity way down, like 10% or so. And then I'll just paint a little bit of fall off onto the edge there. In a way, it's kind of like vignetting a bit. Notice it's a really big, soft brush. I'm just letting that kind of soft, feathered edge of the brush throw a little hint of vignetting around there. At a low opacity, it'll be a slow, gradual change. Like if you turn the eyeball off and on, you should be able to see a before and after. Sometimes when you're working at a really low opacity, each individual pass isn't necessarily noticeable. But if you're working on a non-destructive layer, you can simply turn that eyeball off and on and see a before and after. That's pretty literal. Like I just took a paintbrush and I painted it right onto there, which in this case worked pretty good. What are some other ways that I could add some fall off onto there? What if we did an adjustment layer? Like this is just painting over top, but if I wanted to kind of make it a little bit more intense or a little bit less intense, I could play with the opacity of the layer a bit, but I couldn't really make it more intense. What if I used an adjustment layer? Actually, I'm going to chuck this one out for a second. And I'm going to make an adjustment layer. I'll throw on some levels there. And let's say I wanted to use this levels to lighten or darken the background. If I grab the middle slider, I can make it lighter, which, it's a white background, so you don't really notice anything. I can also use it to make it darker. And I can, wait a minute, I'm darkening it, but the background isn't getting any darker. Why is the background not getting any darker? Because it's white. Interesting. This kind of plays back to like first or second week when we were talking about bit depth. Remember we were talking about how every RGB image, it's 3 color channels, a red channel, a green channel, and a blue channel. And when you're working in 8 bits per channel, each channel has a certain number of shades of gray, from the darkest black to the brightest white. How many shades of gray was that? Anybody remember? 256 shades of gray. So if you went 1, 2, 3, all the way to 256, but they want black to be 0, so they start at 0 to 255. And I said, instead of thinking of the shades of gray, think of it as an elastic string, and on this string, you've got 256 glass beads. A black bead down here at 0, and a white bead up here at 255. If you want to make the image overall brighter or darker, you grab that middle bead, you pull it one side or the other, kind of like grabbing the middle slider and pulling it one side or the other. But if you think about it, the farther you get towards the ends, the less those beads are going to move. Like, here's 0, here's 255. If you grab the middle bead, 128, right in the center there, and you pull it 50 levels this way, a bead further down the string might only move 20 levels. A bead further down the string might only move 2 or 3 levels. And in fact, there's 2 beads on that string that don't go anywhere at all. 0 and 255. Those are the ones that you're holding on to. You can move that middle bead all you want. These 2 aren't going anywhere. And that's what's happening here. I can move this middle bead or this middle slider all I want. 255 isn't going to go anywhere. Something that had an input of 255 will also end up with an output of 255 regardless. Although, there's a slider here called output, and I could reassign what white is. I could say what used to have an input of 255 will now have an output of, say, let's say I did 128, middle gray, 50% gray, right in the center there. I could say what used to have an input of 255, or what used to be white, now has an output of 128. That background has become 50% gray. Interesting. Let's dive a little bit deeper into this. What's the more powerful counterpart to levels? Let's take a look at curves for a second. This will make the input-output thing a little bit more clear. I'm going to throw on a curves adjustment layer here. And on the surface, it looks kind of a lot like levels, doesn't it? We have a black point down here. We have a white point up here. We got the whole histogram of the image. We have a middle. Wait a minute, we don't have a middle slider, do we? How do we make things lighter or darker in curves? Well, we take this line, we lighten it or darken it. We move it up or down. So instead of a middle slider going left and right, we have a line and we can drag it up or down. What does this line represent? No change. If this is 45 degrees, there's been no change to the image. But let's say I grabbed it here in the center. Between 0 and 255, this would be 128. And I pulled that 128 down to, say, 64. If we follow this across, here's 0, here's 128. So something that used to have an input of 128 now has an output, on the 45 degree, it used to have an output of 128. So 128 gave us 128. I've, however, pulled it down to here, so an input of 128 now has an output of only 64. But if we follow a little bit further down, say I come to, 64 here. If I come up, it doesn't have an output of 64 anymore. It's got a much lower output. So this got lowered by 64 levels. This only got lowered by maybe 50. Here, it only got lowered by like 5 maybe, and look at that, 0 didn't go anywhere, and 255 didn't go anywhere. That has some interesting implications when it comes to doing that correction we did in levels. Remember, I took the output slider and I pulled it down, and we were able to make 255 into 128. I could do the same thing in curves. Let me just get rid of that little point there. If I grabbed my output here and pulled this down to 128, we've got the exact same thing going on. What used to be 255, an input of 255, now has an output of 128. And 128 has become 64. Everything has linearly, this is a line now, not a curve, been lowered. Now here's an interesting thought. What do you think would happen if I pulled that 0, that black point, up to 128 as well? So now, if I had an input of 0, I would have an output of, 128. If I had an input of 128, I have an output of, 128. An input of 250, 128. Let's take this a little bit further. What would happen if I moved that 0 all the way to the top and the 255 all the way to the bottom? So instead of a 45 degree this way, I had a 45 degree this way.
The color's inverted.
Inverted. I could say what used to be black becomes white. What used to be white becomes black. I basically get a photographic negative of itself. The yellow wine has become blue. If something was red, it would become cyan. If it was green, it would become magenta. Interesting. Now let's carry that back to the levels analogy there. If I wanted to make that background 50% gray, as I did already there was that output taken from 255. So what used to be 255 is now 128. If I pulled my 0 slider, my blacks, also up to 128, everything's gray. If I continue on and say black becomes white and white becomes black, we have an inverted version of the image. So that's the extreme similarities between levels and curves. Curves has a few other tricks up its sleeves that you'll get to later on, but there you go. Levels and curves are fundamentally very similar. But let's just use that levels layer. I'm just going to throw on a levels. I'm going to make sure that it's below the wine glass because I don't want it to be affecting that wine glass. And I'm just going to darken down the outside there a little bit. And you'll notice that when you make an adjustment layer, oh look, there's a layer mask already attached to it. If I were to grab some black paint, just grab my paintbrush, make sure I got black, 100% opacity, I could remove that darkening from the inside there. There's a little bit of that vignetting around the outside. And the nice thing is, because it's an adjustment layer, if I do want to play around with it, I can just grab this white point and I can play around with it like that. So give it a try. Throw a little bit of a vignette, a little bit of a fall off onto that glass there. You're also not limited to hiding the center on the levels there. Like let's say I made the levels layer and I pulled the white point down to give it a nice vignette. I could, if I wanted, invert that layer mask, Command I, And then with a paintbrush, I could bring it back with white paint around the edges. So I mean, you know, the options are literally limitless.